I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
This morning we're starting in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So you can turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're going to be dealing in the content of the book of 1 Corinthians as the projector is heating up, to answering questions that the Corinthians had. This is one of those books. It is an interesting book. Paul, usually in his letters, it goes off and he tells them what Scripture is, like what gospel is, and he doesn't really pay attention, perhaps, or at least noticeably to us, about anything that's going on in that church that they've asked. He might have heard some things, he might know some things that are going on, but the Corinthians had asked some questions that they wanted answers to. And so, verse 1 of 1 Corinthians 7, we'll start with Annette today. Just get verse 1 of 1 Corinthians chapter 7.
So that you come short with no gift.
1 Corinthians 7? Oh, okay.
So that you come short with no gift, eagerly waiting for the revelation of our Lord.
That's not 1 Corinthians 7. Sounds like 1 Corinthians. Okay. Verse 7, verse 1. Want me to come back to you? Lister, why don't you get that, and we'll come back once you're in chapter 7, verse 1.
Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman.
Okay, so I just want to focus on that phrase for just a second. This shows us that it's concerning the things you wrote to me. Paul had been dealing with division. We'll get to that in a separate section of this book. And immorality. And now he turns to questions. The first question they had was about marriage. About what is proper in times of persecution. We don't get the questions listed to us. Paul doesn't say, okay, here's question 1, and we get the exact question and the wording of the question. However, by how Paul answers, you can sort of rework the question. You can sort of figure out what the question says. Now, when it says, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, what's Paul talking about there?
Well, like you said, they're a time of persecution, so if they're not married, that's kind of better for them at that time.
Okay, so when we're talking about touching, like as far as the Bible sometimes will use what is known as a euphemism. A euphemism is a softer sounding word for a topic that might be uncomfortable. The Bible's talking about sex here in chapter 7. And it says, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Tammy had, if you just read that verse, it might come across as Paul saying it's good not to get married. It's good not to get married. And it's better not to get married. Because when we use that word touch, we're talking about sexual relations there. It's not talking about if I bump into a woman. That's not what the Bible's talking about there. And so we're talking about in a time of persecution. And the way we can know that is further on down the chapter. So if we go down further on down the chapter, we're going to go to verse. Looking for it. Let's start at verse 25, and we'll read to verse 35. So we'll do 2 verses each. Annette, are you there this time? Are you in 1 Corinthians 7 this time? You can get 25. Yeah, you can get 25 and 26. We'll jump across to Jericho. You can get 27, 28. We'll do 2 verses each down the line, and we'll go back to Kala after the first row. 1 Corinthians 7, beginning at verse 25. Down at verse 25.
Because the foolishness of God is
Not you're in chapter 7. Chapter 7. Verse 25 of chapter 7.
Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one meant from the Lord. Yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy.
Yeah, verse 26 as well, please.
So I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is.
Across to Jericho. 27, 28.
Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I will spare you that.
But I say this, brothers, the time is short. From now on, both those who have wives may be as though they had none, and those who weep as though they didn't weep, and those who rejoice as though they didn't rejoice, and those who buy as though they didn't possess, and those who use the word as not using it to its fullest. For the mode of this world passes away.
I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife.
34 and 35, Jeremiah. That'll be good.
And his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world. How can she please her husband? I'm saying this for your own good. Do not restrict you, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way, in undivided devotion to the Lord.
Okay, so if I was to rework this question, it might go something like this. Is it better to be married or unmarried? Since we're facing persecution right now. And what happens if we're married? Does that change? In other words, it could be almost a two-part question. We need to remember that's the context. Paul does give a general truth that the unmarried can have a different focus than those who are married. Those who are unmarried can focus on the things of the Lord. Why is that true? We'll get to Gord's comment in just a second. Why is it true that the unmarried people can focus more on the things of the Lord than a married person can? According to Paul here. What could be distracting? Wife?
Providing for your family.
Providing for your family? Children? Now, does Paul say that's a bad thing? Is Paul coming along here and chastising married people for being distracted?
Married people can still serve. It's just not in the capacity of a single person.
Okay. Bill, you had something too.
Well, I just thought this is normal day-to-day period of time. He doesn't really say what the present distress is, but obviously they're under persecution.
Yeah. No. Well, I was bringing it back to that, but there is a general principle here that an unmarried person can care for the things of the Lord in a different way than a married person can. But the point I'm making is, Paul is not chastising married people for having to care for their family. That's a God-given responsibility. That's still serving the Lord. To come along and say, well, I can't do this because I have to care for my family. God told you to do that. You're not breaking God's law by doing that. It is true, though, that single people have different responsibilities. Single people should be very focused on what they can do for the church because they do not have many of those earthly distractions. But as Bill was saying, this is a time of persecution. We need to keep that in mind. Paul is not saying, in fact, he says so, if you do marry, you have not sinned, because it is not sinful to marry. The chapter needs to be taken in the context of persecution. Paul says it's good for a man not to touch a woman in this present distress. That's why it's good. It's not, God said in the beginning, it is not good for man to be alone. Therefore, I will make a helpmeet for him. God said it was good to be married. So when Paul comes and says in verse 1 of chapter 7, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, we have to know what the context is. However, Paul does say, go on in verse 2, and we're going to need this. Gord, you want to get verses 2 through 5, please, of chapter 7. Yes, please.
Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each one have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of the lack of self-control.
Paul just finished in chapter 6 talking about sexual immorality, fornication, adultery. Just finished talking about that. And now he comes to marriage. What does he tell married couples? What does that mean? I know without being vulgar and crude, what does that mean? You can use euphemisms like the Bible does here.
Continue to be nice to each other in an extra special way.
There you go. But what we're talking about here is that there is a component to the marriage relationship when it comes to sex. That is a component. And husbands and wives need to remember that they do not own their own bodies when they are married. We are autonomous people. Say, well, it's my body, I can do with it what I want. Married couples are to be joined together as one. No longer two, but one. Therefore, together, couples should want to make sure that their spouse is not straying. And one of those ways to do that is to make sure that their needs are being met. It is not one person's needs against another person's needs. Again, it's both. And so that's what it's talking about. It's saying don't deprive one another of that, because Satan is going to tempt you. And Satan will tempt. And we know that Satan does tempt because we see adultery all over the place. Bill.
Well, at this point in Corinth, sexual immorality was rampant.
Yes.
Like he's addressing a problem that was in that church, not in this church. That they believed that was all right.
Sure.
So
every man have his own wife.
yeah.
Every woman have her own husband. He is dealing. You're right. We need to also place this in the context of Corinth. It's a very sexual immoral city. So it needed to be made known. You're married. You're married to your spouse, not to other people. You have desires. That's what your spouse is for. Not to go out and be with other people. You do not have an open marriage where everyone can just go and be with whoever they want. You're married, you're married. Stay married. And that's really the next point in verses 10 through 10 through 16. Let's go read 10 through 16. Callie, you can get 10 to 12, and Bill 13 to 16.
But to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. But to the rest I say, not the Lord, but if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her.
And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. The unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy.
I get 15 and 16 too.
That if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us all to peace. So how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife?
All right. You could now see the question turned. Okay, the Corinthians. All right, we're in this present distress. You said it's better to be single during present distress than married. What happens if and you said, all right, believers, okay, stay together. What happens if my spouse is an unbeliever? So in other words, I married an unbeliever, whether I married them before I was a Christian or after I was a Christian. This passage does not make a distinction. So when we come along and say, well, it's sinful to marry a non-Christian, you can't use this passage to teach it, and you can't use any other passage in the New Testament either. This passage talks about an unbeliever, but does not tell us at what point the couple married. And we should not read that into the text. But what happens if my spouse is an unbeliever? Should I divorce them?
No, you shouldn't, because you, by his example and so on, you can win the person over as a Christian.
Yeah. In the present distress, not to divorce, but that's a general statement. Don't divorce. Now, people come along, well, what about Matthew 19:9? Paul's not talking about that here. Paul's talking about this present distress, but he lays down a general principle. On the whole, Christians should not want to divorce. Sometimes, verse 10 says they will. What happens if they do divorce? And we're assuming, we're going to make the assumption here that there is no fornication, no adultery. It's just divorce. What is Paul's instructions? I can't, you got to speak up, James, you're at the back.
They should stay separated.
Or?
Rejoin to each other.
Yeah. Remain unmarried or be reconciled. We're going to make the assumption here, because Paul is not talking about Matthew 19:9, that the divorce was for another cause other than fornication. Those are the two options: remain unmarried or be reconciled. If one of the spouses go along and married, that's dealt with in Matthew 19:9. They commit adultery. But if we want to remain following Christ, we follow Paul's directions here, which are Christ's directions. But Paul says, don't do that. if you cannot, if it is possible not to do that. If your unbelieving spouse is willing to live with you, in other words, is willing to stay married to you, even in times of persecution, because that's what this is, then stay married. But if they do depart, you are not compelled to live in a marriage that is they're not willing to live in. That does not give you the right to go out and marry. Not under bondage here is not saying, okay, now you're loose to go marry again. Under bondage here means that, in the context that, all right, they've divorced you, you can accept that and still follow Christ. Remain unmarried or be reconciled. Those are the options. If you have been divorced by your unbelieving spouse, remain unmarried or be reconciled. And so that's the context here. Present distress. That's why you would come along and think, okay, if this wasn't talking about persecution, why would the unbelieving spouse all of a sudden just divorce you? That does happen, but Paul is talking about present distress. That's why the unbelieving spouse may go ahead and divorce you, because they don't want to suffer the persecution that you're suffering for the cause of Christ. And it's an important point that we realize that. So there are questions on marriage. Paul's general statement about marriage. What's his general answer to married people during times of persecution? What's his general answer? If I'm married, what? James?
Stay together, remain married, and
yeah, that's his general statement. To the married, remain married during this time of persecution. And that's a general statement in of itself. To single people, what's his general statement during this time of persecution?
Remain single so you can focus on the Lord.
Yes, remain single. Not only can you focus on the Lord, it's going to be easier during persecution because you don't have to worry about carrying along a spouse and children. You can go wherever the persecution is not. You are free to move. If a single person marries during this time of persecution, have they sinned? No, they have not sinned. Just because something may be better doesn't mean that thing which is not better is necessarily sinful. There is wisdom that we can apply. However, Paul says here, if we're going to be tempted, and we are being tempted to commit sexual immorality, it's better to marry than to go ahead and sin. So single people, yes, they can focus on the Lord if they remain unmarried. Yes, it might be better for them in times of persecution if they remain unmarried at that time. But they might be facing temptation to go out and commit fornication. That's not good. If that's the case, better to marry. Those are Paul's general statements in times of persecution. Let's keep chapter 7 in its context. Let's not come along and tell single people, you're better if you remain unmarried. You're more righteous than these married people. That's not true. And you can't come to the married, you're less righteous than these single people here. Or you can't serve the Lord like these single people can. Shouldn't say that either. Remember the context. That's important. And so that's Paul's look at marriage. How is it what are some considerations we can make in times of persecution? Any other comments before we move on to chapter 8? All right, let's move on to chapter 8. We're to Tammy. I'd like you to get chapter 8, verses 1 to 3.
Now concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And if anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing, yet as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, this one is known by him.
All right, so we're now going to talk about things offered to idols. Corinth was an idolatrous city. We come along and say Corinth was an immoral city with fornication. Fornication and idolatry often went hand in hand. You worship the idol, part of the way you worship the idol is through sexual immorality. That's the terrible thing, is it went hand in hand. Prostitutes were in the idol temple. And so it's only natural to talk about idolatry. Okay, now we're a Christian. What about idols? I'm certain that's the question. Can we eat in the idol temple? I assure you that's probably what the question was. Can we eat in the idol temple even if we're not worshiping the idol? James, you had something?
Generally, when people are unfaithful to God, they're also unfaithful to their partner.
They're also unfaithful, sorry?
To their partners.
Yeah.
They don't have that sense of, they commit fornication against God, they commit fornication against their partner.
Yeah. When we're unfaithful to God, we're unfaithful in a lot of things. And our partner would be one of them. So, coming to idolatry. The question is likely, can a Christian eat in an idol temple even if they're not worshiping the idol? There are some people who say, well, yes, we can do that. And others say, no, we can't do that. And so Paul's going to answer the question. Now, he does say in verse 1, we have knowledge, but knowledge puffs up, love edifies. What does that mean? Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies.
So knowledge is men's knowledge, or soul knowledge, not knowledge from God.
Okay. We have to figure out whether we're talking about man's knowledge or God's knowledge. Man's knowledge can puff us up, make us arrogant. But I don't think Paul's talking about man's knowledge here. Bill.
I think that God's knowledge can, if we're not careful, we can become to think that we know it all, and we look at others, maybe not understanding where they're at, and put forth an arrogant attitude. That doesn't mean, that we can do wrong, but it's how we handle, I think, that knowledge.
Yeah. Paul's going to go on in this chapter and say, Christians know the idol is nothing. It's a hunk of wood. It's a hunk of gold. It's absolutely nothing. We're not to worship it either. Christians, mature Christians especially, know that the idol is nothing. We're A, not to worship the idol. But B, if we don't worship the idol is just a hunk of stone. And so, any meat offered to an idol, if I eat the meat, just the meat, I'm not there to worship the idol, I haven't sacrificed it in worship to the idol, I'm just eating it. Which, by the way, was something that happened in Corinth because you had excess meat. It was sold in the marketplace. It was sold in the marketplace, but also, basically speaking, these idol temples had almost what we call restaurants. The priests would offer the sacrifices to the idols, and whatever was left over, all right, we're going to go give it to people to eat. Why waste it? It's meat. And so people would come to the idol temple and sit down and they'd eat. And so Paul says, okay, we have knowledge. The idol's nothing. The meat that was offered to the idol hasn't stained the meat. If we're not offering it in worship to the idol. That's knowledge. Now, someone can take that knowledge and use it in a way that causes another person to stumble. How might that happen? Gord.
Well, they may not be a Christian. Say, you're a Christian, how come you're eating meat offered idols?
Okay.
And once they say that, then we need to stop.
All right, so our example to non-Christians. who might know us and say, okay, you don't worship idols. You come along, you've been trying to teach me not to worship idols, yet you're eating meats offered to idols. Okay, it might stop a non-Christian from becoming a Christian or seeing that they're wrong with idolatry. But how might else it cause a Christian to stumble? How? James.
Yeah, we Christian, person who is just going the faith, not knowing everything. And you want to knowledge of it, so that refrain from doing certain things. But, we Christian might see you going to a bar, maybe you're not going there to drink anything. You went there just to meet somebody or to use the bathroom.
Yeah.
But they're seeing you coming out of the bar, you were stronger there, and it says there, love edifies.
Mm-hmm.
So because of knowing that you might affect somebody else in your action, you don't do it. You keep away from it.
Yeah. The idol temple here, if a non-Christian, a weaker Christian, by weak Christian we do not mean that they're a sinful Christian. They're a young Christian. Necessarily, babies are weaker than adults. Babies don't know everything. Young children, they imitate their parents. They may see the person eating in the idol temple and come along and not realize that A, the person didn't offer the meat and worship the idol, or B, they may come along and think, well, it must be okay to worship idols, or they might not know that the meat isn't affected by the idol. There's a whole bunch of things that a weaker Christian might not realize in connection to the idol. And then they might go and say, well, that stronger brother over there, stronger sister over there, they did it, therefore it must be okay. And they go ahead and do something that the stronger brother or sister did not do. The older brother or the stronger brother or sister did not sin by eating the meat offered to the idol. That's not what the sin was. What the sin was is down in verse 9. And that's where we need to read to figure out how love edifies. Love builds up. We're going to come back to Christina. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Verses 9 through 13.
But take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone sees you, who have knowledge, dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience, if he is weak, be strengthened to eat things sacrificed to idols? For through your knowledge, he who is weak is ruined, but rather for those whose sake Christ died. And so, by sinning against the brethren and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause my brother to stumble.
Okay. The sin wasn't eating the meat. The sin from the older brother is causing another brother to stumble into sin. That's the sin. Our example matters. Love edifies. I need to look out for my brethren. That's what I'm to do. And so when it comes to things where sin is there, it's not committed by everybody, but it's very easy to come along and say, I can see how someone might think that I'm partaking in something sinful even when I'm not. We always need to check, are what I'm doing going to affect how another person follows Christ? Am I going to cause another brother to sin? I don't think the Corinthian brethren here were just going out and saying, I don't care about other people. I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to use my liberty. But we've got to be careful we don't use our liberty as a stumbling block to those who are weak. Paul said, I will never eat meat again. Now, remember, in that context, you usually get meat in the idol temple. You usually get meat in the marketplace. Paul's saying that's how far he was willing to go. He would completely give up his liberty to eat meat if it was going to cause his brother to stumble. Are we willing to do that? That we hold our liberties, our personal liberties, very tight in this country and very tight in Western society. If we truly have liberty, personal liberty, and that liberty is going to cause my brother to stumble into sin, not just be offended. I'm not talking about just being offended here. I don't like what you're doing. That's not what we're talking about. It's going to cause another brother to sin by our example of our exercise of our liberty. Would we be able to give up that liberty? And the answer to that should be yes. I would do anything that is righteous in order to win souls to Christ. Anything that is righteous. And that's the point. James and then Cal.
We have to look at it. Christ, the Son of God, came and he gave his entire life. He gave his life for us. A simple task like giving up something to save your brother, brother in Christ. A simple task like giving up eating meat shouldn't be something that we put before Christ,
Yeah. Yeah, we need to. Liberty defined is just that freedom. I have the freedom to do or the freedom not to do. And we're necessarily talking about causing our brother to sin, not just offending them. Kala, before we close.
So that's knowingly.
Yes.
Knowingly. But sometimes you don't even know if your brother is doing things according to God's will, and people, if they disagree with you, they will judge you from a matter that it should, that you have not sinned, but they're just judging you for something.
Yeah, there is a difference. We do need, as I said, this is not talking about disagreements between brethren. This is talking about two people. I see someone doing something, therefore I go do something, but I take it farther. I thought that brother was doing something that I might have considered was okay, but that extra something was sinful. We're not talking about disagreements over Scripture here. That's something else. We're talking about leading our brother into sin. If I lead my brother into sin unknowingly, and I find out later that that's what I did, I should repent. Just like when we commit any sin. Sometimes we don't know we've committed sin against someone else's conscience because we don't know that we wounded their conscience. But when we find out, we should repent. But this is not talking about disagreements. This is talking about necessarily leading brethren into sin. It was not sinful to eat meat offered to idols, even in the idol temple. However, by eating in the idol temple, as chapter 10 would say, by eating in the idol temple, you can easily, it is very easy, to cause your brother to sin. Therefore, don't do it. It was, even though it was not wrong, the meat offered to idols is still meat. Don't go eat in the idol temple. You want to eat meat, eat it in the privacy of your own home. Someone says, this was offered to idols, don't eat of it. Not because the meat has changed, because you don't want to wound someone's conscience. You ask no questions for conscience sake, chapter 10 would say. And that's a good lesson to do. Don't ask too many questions if the questions don't need to be asked. Because if something is not sinful, it is not sinful. Let's not make things sinful that are not sinful, but let's watch out for our brethren.
I'm not ashamed to